but you've come up with like you want to test machines. You want to come up with these ACT tests, these AI consciousness tests to tell us, whether they are conscious or whether we're rational in believing them. Maybe you can help me with that too. What
Well,
does the ACT? What is the ACT test? I guess,
oh, sure.
and and is it meant to give us justification for believing that they're conscious, or does it give us like knowledge that they are conscious?
Ooh, well, okay. So I'm glad you mentioned, first of all, my collaborator,
Yeah.
because the reporters who are talking about this, like I was on the BBC this morning,
Oh
they
wow.
just never, I tell them the ACT test was developed with Edwin Turner, my dear
There we
colleague,
go.
when I was at the
Turner.
Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And see, he's an astrophysicist, he's a professor of astrophysics, student of Marvin Minsky over
Oh
at
wow.
MIT. But
Okay.
anyway, so Ed and I were just kind of shooting the breeze. And, the idea was, why not probe an AI for consciousness to see if it understands philosophical puzzles or religious puzzles?
Yeah.
So, in the context of theology, I mean, and even just ordinary people who aren't studying theology, but they're asking what it all means, it's very common to ask whether there's life beyond death, whether the mind is separable from the body. I mean, there are even movies like Freaky Friday in which
Yeah.
people change minds, change bodies, right? Mind
Mm.
shift.
Yeah.
So in our culture and in other cultures, there's kind of, I won't say universal because that's pretty dangerous. There might be an anthropologist listening, but
That's right.
there's a tendency for humans to actually even roughly, at least very roughly, understand that there's something like the possibility of a mind that is separable from a body. And so we were interested in the possibility of whether an AI would get the issue. And of course, we're talking only about a narrow group of AIs. We're talking about highly intelligent language processing AI systems, the kind now
Hmm.
that are being developed by Google and other AI companies like the Lambda system and GPT-3,
Mhm.
these generative models. So anyway, we were asking whether you could have a question and answer test. And so we devised one that we put out at first in Scientific American and then as a patent application at Princeton University,
Yeah.
patent that.
Wow.
And then I decided I'm going to keep writing this up. And so I put it in my book and I added a bunch of questions. And so that's where things are. But the reporters, because this is in the news right now, whether Lambda is conscious,
Right. Right.
saying you can run this test on Lambda. And as I said, always, like I said this in the book, in the Scientific American paper, you can only do it at the R&D stage with these machine learning systems before you train them on data sets involving
Ah.
mind. Otherwise, they're going to give baked in answers, right?
Right. Right. Right.
You
Right.
can't trust those answers. So you can't run the test in those contexts. You have to use other tests. But I have discussed other tests as well, which I'm happy to tell you about.
Yeah, so I knew my brain just would not remember Turner's name because in the same conversation you hear of the Turing test. I'm like Turner Turing, and it just wouldn't stand. Um, a lot of people will point to the Turing test, especially in like popular thinkers. We'll talk about the Turing test. It shows up in science fiction a lot. How would your ACT test? How does that differ than Alan Turing's Turing test?
So Turing's test is designed to probe for intelligence.
Hmm.
And the criteria there is whether you would fool a human, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Okay. And so the issue here isn't intelligence, it's consciousness. Now, in the case of the ACT test, we're running it on fairly intelligent linguistic systems. So that kind of makes it a little bit easy to conflate.
Yeah.
But I do think that in principle, a machine could pass the Turing test, but not pass my test,
Yeah. Yeah.
or even vice versa. So you can imagine a machine that really sort of sounds like one of these I, Robot short stories, right? By
Hmm.
Asimov, where
Yeah.
the robot dreams for example, and it understands the felt quality of experience, but for some reason doesn't convince people
Oh
that
yeah.
it's human. I mean, maybe it doesn't behave human-like, or maybe Gary Marcus is the judge and he catches it messing up on its causal reasoning, but
Hmm.
nevertheless it's conscious. You don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really fascinating. What a terrible predicament if it is conscious and can't convince us that it is. And it's like, no, I should have rights. And we're like, no, I don't think you're not passing the Turing test, even if you pass the ACT, the ACT test. That's really fascinating.
Mhm.
In Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, Philip K. Dick poses like this, I think it's Voight comp test, and it's an empathy test where he
Yeah.
gives the androids. Um, I wonder I wonder how different do you call it ACT or do you say ACT test?
We don't care.
Okay, so I'll
Yeah,
I'll call it ACT. That's a little easier. Um,
but that test is a lot like it. In fact, when I
yeah.
was writing the test, I was thinking of that. I show that to my students, that clip.
Oh yes.
Oh, I love it. It's a beautiful clip. But notice there though, Rachel was an android,
Mhm.
and Deckard was running that kind of test on embodied systems that had certain things like retinal
Yeah,
impact
that was a big one in the movie, especially
assessment.
seeing.
Right,
Yeah.
they were looking at the iris, and I don't remember the details, but in any case, there aren't any kind of embodied, uh, you know, body specific tests here that we're running. It's
Okay.
more just verbal Q&A, sort of
Okay.
like the Turing test, where you could even do it, with text.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
Are you guys running any of that at the Center for the Future Mind? Are you guys like implementing the ACT test while people are working on the robots and such?
No, because of the machine learning issue with these data sets,
Yeah.
right? Now, I don't know, maybe the Defense Department does it at the R&D stage.
Yeah.
I mean, people have reached out.
Yeah.
I can't go into detail, but
Oh,
I mean,
okay. Wow.
there are always more sophisticated systems out there than what the public has access to as well. I
Right.
mean, so I hope they're reading the literature. Um, there's other ways to determine whether machines are conscious, if you want me to talk about those too.
Please. Yeah. Yeah. Let's do
Yeah,
that.
because what I said in my book, in this book, Artificial You, because the first 4 chapters of the book they were on the topic of machine consciousness.
Mhm.
I said, look, we don't just need one test. We need a toolkit,
Yeah.
a kit of multiple types of tests that we can actually run when conditions are appropriate, and use that as the sort of rough building blocks to devise better tests.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, what if your test results conflict
Yeah.
in the same system? I mean, the dialogue here is just beginning,
Mm.
I think. Although if you talk to certain AI experts, they think it's over, the dialogue's over, and that of course machine learning systems aren't conscious. That's what I'm hearing a lot of in the news about Lambda, of
Yeah.
course. But what I think you can do is you can examine neural prosthetics. So I think that's the most promising angle, actually. Okay, so there are several ongoing projects right now to put brain chips in people's heads
Yeah.
to improve and enhance mental function, as in the case of Elon Musk's Neuralink, but
Yeah.
also importantly, as neural prosthetics to, for example, provide an artificial hippocampus. So Ted
Oh wow.
Berger over at USC I think he's in phase 2 clinical trials. I mean, these
Whoa.
implanted into, well, you know, the chips, you're only able to use them in the lab. It's a long story. They're currently independent. They're not inside the head.
Okay.
Although you have to have neurosurgery to connect to the chip in the
Oh,
lab.
so the connector's in there, but the chip doesn't actually go in yet.
Yeah, for
Okay.
Ted Berger,
Gotcha.
whereas Musk at Neuralink has it, is getting very close, I think, to human clinical trials. He has it in great apes right now, like
Oh
implanted
wow.
wireless connection. It's a pretty amazing.
Yeah.
What Berger's doing is he's simulating the ability of the hippocampus to lay down new information.
Hmm.
The hippocampus is relatively well understood
Okay.
relative to what we know of the rest of the brain, which isn't a lot, but
Yeah.
and so these algorithms can actually compute in ways that allow one to lay down new memory. Okay, so what does this have to do with machine consciousness?
Hmm.
Well, being married to an FDA regulatory attorney, doing searches on what's being developed right now, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that there are a lot of people developing chips for other parts of the brain, including parts of the brain that are implicated in debates about the neural basis of consciousness as potentially being part of the neural basis of consciousness. And so what I project is that if the chip in the brain efforts continue, and they may very well, either for enhancement or therapeutic purposes, that we will eventually learn whether chips are the right stuff
Yeah.
for consciousness. And if millions of dollars are just pouring in, and you've had dozens of years of research and you still can't get a chip that replaces parts of the brain underlying conscious experience, it's not unreasonable to suspect that machines built with those chips aren't conscious.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you have to be careful. You can't make claims about other kinds of chips.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Right. But I think that is a sensible path. It's gonna happen, I suspect. We'll have some kind of sense. And the real question there is whether the same chips will be in the computers that we need to test that are in brains, right?
Yeah. And that'll be some evidence for either for like multiple realizability of, mental states in chips or in organism or not, at least for those chips. That maybe, it'd be evidence that those chips can't support consciousness.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing there, and I can say this because your audience philosophers,
Yeah.
is we may have instances of multiple realizability already with the artificial hippocampus. Depends on how you frame the issue,
Oh,
right?
okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
what level of grain, but you could have that, but still have an epic failure when it comes to conscious states. So
Yeah.
what I really need for machine consciousness isn't just multiple realizability of a belief state,
Okay.
but multiple realizability of phenomenal states.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That would also probably factor into whether like all of our mental states are conscious or not, and like because if you can have a belief
Yeah,
state, right? So then that might even settle that debate too, whether and the phenomenologists start ripping out their hair right now. That's really fascinating. I I wonder about oh, so you call that the chip test. So we have the chip test, right? Is that what you demarcate as the
that's
chip?
the test. Yeah,
Okay.
and that's my idea. Um, and I wrote that up in my book.
Yeah.
And footnote here,
Mhm.
it will help tremendously to understand whether extended consciousness is possible.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
could test extended consciousness. And it's funny because I say this in some recent papers and in a book I'm writing right now. People always say extended consciousness is really hard and the extended mind hypothesis doesn't depend on it. But I think it's a testable claim. And I don't
Hmm.
think it's as impossible as people think.
Okay.
Because if you have these neural prosthetics and they can actually realize consciousness,
Mhm.
you could just as easily have them outside of the brain, as
Right.
in the case of Berger's lab.
Yeah,
And
yeah, right. The chip's not even in the
actually
brain.
find
Yeah.
out
Yeah.
through testing the subjects whether there's extended consciousness.